So a jerkbait is hands down one of the best ways to trigger fish all throughout the year. Whether you're fishing up north or whether you're fishing down south, there is just no better way to catch those stingy fish that seemingly don't want to eat anything else. The real key is knowing how to work that bait to catch those fish. Dang, 3-pound spot too. Getting into some bigger ones here. Whether you're a guy that goes out and spends $30 on a jerkbait or you spend $10 on a jerkbait, all of them catch fish almost identically. Some of them have different actions and some of them work a little bit better, but they all do the same job of having erratic reactions to get fish to bite it. But the key between all of these different jerkbaits is how you work the bait. And that's what I want to talk about today, is how you specifically work a jerkbait in order to catch more fish, whether you have forward-facing sonar or whether you don't have forward-facing sonar. So stick around, you guys are not going to want to miss this video. So a jerkbait is one of my absolute favorite baits for the reason that I always could seemingly get bit on it. Whether it was middle of the summer or whether it was cold in the wintertime, I could always get a bite on it because it was something that people didn't throw as much, because it's something that takes a little bit of experience, a little bit of knowledge to throw. If you don't know how to throw it, a lot of times you're not going to get as many bites as if you do know how to throw it. And so when I grew up fishing as a co-angler or fishing from the bank, I could get bit in areas that had a lot of pressure because I was throwing different jerkbaits, because it was just something that those fish hadn't seen. It's really easy for people to want to throw a spinnerbait or a chatterbait because it's a steady retrieve and you can cover water a lot faster with it, but you won't get the same reaction that you do out of a jerkbait with those baits that have a steady retrieve. Because if you think about when a bait fish is wounded or it's trying to get away, it's oftentimes going in all kinds of different motions, which is what a jerkbait can represent when worked properly. So the first thing I'll do is I will walk you through a cast. The first thing I do is I throw that jerkbait out and reel it down, and then I start my retrieve. And you'll notice as I'm working my retrieve, I try to vary it a little bit. I generally go with a 1-1-2 approach, where I'll hit it once, hit it twice, and then, or hit it once, and then twice. And what that does is that kind of gets that bait to walk back, forth, and then gives it a little bit of a varying retrieve where it'll bounce a little bit and have a little bit more of a reaction to it. And you'll notice that I'm really not reeling my reel handle too much, and the key with that is I actually use an 8-to-1 gear ratio reel, which allows me to barely turn that handle to pick up slack faster to be able to work that bait faster. So you can get a better look here where I'm actually working that with my wrist. I hit it straight down and then I point the rod straight back at the bait, because what that does is it pulls that bait forward and then gives that bait slack to allow that bait to have the most action that it can have side to side. Because if you're not physically looking at a fish on forward-facing sonar, you're trying to get the most action out of that bait as physically possible. And in here, I'm just practicing casting it in a pool, but you'll notice that I'm flaring that reel handle a little bit and getting that bait to move forward just as much as I am side to side. And that would be what I would do is if I was watching fish on my forward-facing sonar, that would be something that I would utilize. But since if you don't have it, then you're just gonna try to get as much action side to side out of it as you physically can. This is something I recommend for everybody, is taking a bait to a pool, whether you have a pool or just a clear body of water, and casting it in that pool to see how to get that bait to work, so that way you know on a long cast, on a short cast, what that bait is gonna do, because a jerkbait reacts differently at close range than it does further away. So now you know how to work a jerkbait, but what does that all mean? When do you work it a certain way versus when do you work it a different way? And that's what we're gonna talk about right now. So when it comes to using a jerkbait, there's two different ways that you can throw it. You can throw it to cover water and find active feeding fish, or you can use it to trigger fish that aren't active. Those are the two separate ways. And I use the bait a couple different ways for each one. When I'm trying to find active fish, covering water, whether it be down an edge, on a flat, anywhere over top of grass, that's when I will use my traditional retrieve that you've seen, where I'm doing a 1-2 kind of back and forth to really bring that bait in. If I'm trying to trigger inactive fish in an area, whether it be over a brush pile, whether it be on a dock, or whether it just be in an area you know the fish are at, that's when I'm really gonna try to work that jerkbait a little bit differently, and that's when I will really snap it and point that bait back at the rod, because I want that bait to work as much side to side as possible before it gets out of the strike zone where that fish is at. And that's really, really important, because if that fish is on a dock pole, you don't want to move it past the dock pole super fast, or else you're out of the strike zone really fast. Especially for you guys that have forward-facing sonar, you really can watch those fish to see how they're gonna react to that jerkbait, and a lot of times you have to wait a while for that fish to realize that bait's there, come up to it, and then you can move that bait faster once that fish is already interested, but you have to get that fish interested first. So right here you can see me fishing a jerkbait, what seemingly looks like over open water, but I'm actually fishing a grass edge. And what I'm doing is using that jerkbait to cover a little bit of water to see where those fish are at, because a lot of times those fish will be scattered along these edges, but they'll be grouped up in small groups along that edge. You just have to figure out where they're at. And so what I'm doing is using my forward-facing sonar to watch for fish that come up at that jerkbait. And what I'm gonna do is when those fish come up at that jerkbait, you have to play a game of cat and mouse, where you might have to pause the jerkbait like you see me do there to let that fish get close enough to where then as soon as that fish sees the jerkbait, gets close enough, I will start to speed it up to almost play keep away with it, and that's how you end up catching a lot of those fish. And this isn't a big fish, this is like a 1.5 pound largemouth, but it was a fun fish, and it ended up leading me to a group of fish that were set up on this edge, all because that jerkbait in that clean water is really good at triggering those fish. Buddy, you are gonna hurt my feelings. So here we have another fish that I see on the Panoptix. What I'm doing is I'm looking at that fish and I'm trying to get him to react. And you can watch my rod tip right here, and I'm doing that 2-1 that I've talked about, where I kind of keep it slowly moving, but I'm trying to keep it just above that fish and away from that fish. One key thing about a jerkbait is you never want that jerkbait to go below that fish. Bass are up feeders, and right there I hook them up, but bass are up feeders, and so they need to be looking up at their prey, and that's how you keep those fish interested, because bait fish never go below their predators. They always stay above them and try to keep away from them. So one thing I do want to touch on when it comes to fishing a jerkbait is your drag setting. And I know it doesn't sound like it would be a make or break situation, but it really is when you start getting around big fish. I've seen it happen all too often, and I've experienced it all too often, where you hook a big fish and your instinct on a bait casting reel is to have your drag cinch down, you know, so that way when you set the hook, no drag slips out. But then what happens is when you hook a big fish, a lot of times they'll give you a couple big head shakes where you go, okay, it's a big one, and then they run, and if you don't have time to thumb the reel, you end up losing the fish. Or I've seen it happen where you try to thumb the reel and that fish goes in spurts instead of it being a nice smooth transition, because you're trying to thumb it but it's not smooth, and so you end up pulling the hooks out of that fish. So what I like to do is I find that sweet spot where I have my drag just tight enough that when I lean on those fish it doesn't slip, but if they try to run really fast and hard, it'll move enough, and that way I can just turn it maybe a quarter of a turn to get that drag to move, because that way I'm gonna have a smooth drag, I won't lose those fish on the hook set, and then I can still fight those fish in the long run, and I'll end up landing more big fish because of that. So keep that in mind when you're fishing a jerkbait. So here I'll show you a target-oriented fish. I have a grass patch right here where I see those fish in that grass patch, and I'm trying to get fish to come out of an isolated grass patch. Right there I hook up with that fish, and you hear that drag tighten down a little bit, because what I do is I keep that drag just tight enough where it doesn't slip, but loose enough that those fish can run with it. I'll break that down here in a minute. But I was trying to play keep away with that fish with that jerkbait, because in clean water there's no better way to lure them out of that grass.
Big one, but I finally got me one. Two.
As always, guys, we're going to end with a Bible verse, and today it's not exactly a verse as it is kind of a little bit of a story, and so it's about Abraham. Abraham is talking to God, and God tells Abraham to take his only son that he has waited his entire life for, his only son, up to the top of a mountain and sacrifice him for the Lord. And pretty much without hesitation, Abraham, trusting the Lord, says, okay. And you got to remember, this is Abraham's only son that he has prayed for, that he has asked for. It's his only one. And so he takes him to the top of this mountain, gets him over to the spot where the Lord says to sacrifice him, and he is literally knife in hand getting ready to sacrifice his son, his only son, and the Lord says, okay, wait, never mind, here's a lamb, or here's a ram, sacrifice this lamb. He says, okay. And so the reason I tell you that is because Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son because the Lord just wanted to see how strong his faith was. Because Abraham knew that because he trusted in the Lord, that the Lord was going to have his back no matter what. You know, God can do anything. And so sometimes all the things we go through in life might just be to see how far you're willing to go to get there. You know what I mean? And so as long as you're trusting the Lord, then anything is possible, but you have to put your faith in the Lord above in order for that to happen. So keep your head up no matter what you're going through, trust in the Lord, and everything will work out exactly the way it's supposed to. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button to follow along. But God bless every single one of you guys, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.